we haven't actually seen any substantial evidence from the Defense Department, from the Pentagon, about that these boats are actually carrying drugs.
Hey guys, it's been a week. Let's just put it that way and draw a line and move on. Get on with the show.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. Because we've kind of touched on a subject over the last few weeks now, but it might be a good idea to sort of draw it out a bit more, and that is this issue of these strikes that have been carried out by the administration, right, on what they're calling drug boats, narco terrorists. There's been a huge amount of pushback within both parties, I think it's fair to say, in this country, and also from the countries where these boats have originated from, most notably Venezuela and Colombia.
I would also mention that we're seeing some pushback from allies as well, who are starting to really raise the alarm bells about this. And, it's been hard because we've gotten sort of this drip, bit by bit reporting. They've been announcing these strikes as they've happened, but we're starting to get a full picture. We're trying to understand, how much of this is saber rattling and how much of this, could escalate into something much bigger.
Yeah, and I think if we take a step back and just say this is the administration has said that they are striking alleged narco traffickers in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. They've struck a number of boats. To this point, more than 70 people we know have been killed. And President Trump, his administration, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, say this is about keeping the homeland safe and preventing narcotics from entering the U.S. That is what the administration has said to this point. But as you both alluded to, this has raised a lot of alarm bells, not just among Democrats, we should say also Republicans here in the U.S. and allies. And of course, then also created a bit of a crisis in the region. So it has really, I think, crystallized so many different points of Donald Trump's foreign policy and domestic policy. And I think for that reason, it's been fascinating to watch. And we can dig into all of that. But I just wanted to kind of note that I found it so interesting that we've seen a number of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who have said, if we are striking drug traffickers, narco traffickers who present a real and clear danger to the U.S., this is something we can get behind, legality aside, under international law, but give us more information. So when we say that we're getting drips of information, trickles of information, we're not the only ones who are looking for more information from the administration.
I think as well, those drips of information, it's kind of the manner in which they've come as well that's causing some consternation, right? Because most of the time they've come from a social media post from the War Secretary, Pete Hegseth, complete with kind of grainy video that almost looks like it's something out of a computer game or something, where you see a small boat and then you see a strike and an explosion. And then we're sort of just told, another hit on a narco terrorist. And when journalists and, as you say, Sumi, elected lawmakers have kind of sought out more information on this, it's kind of, operational security, etc. And there hasn't been more forthcoming, to the point where we've actually had members of the Senate Armed Services Committee writing a letter to the administration saying, we want more information on this. The normal course of affairs is that we're briefed. We're not necessarily saying that this is a wrong course of action or anything like that, but we just want to know, what are you doing and who are you doing it to? Because that is still very unclear. And at the crux of the matter is a question of international law as well, because these strikes are happening in international waters. They're not happening in American waters where you could, mount some sort of this is a defense against an attack. Ordinarily, there are international law norms that would be obeyed, and we haven't seen that happen thus far anyway.
You kind of hit on something really interesting, Katrina, which is that Secretary Hegseth has been announcing these by social media, which obviously is a page out of the Donald Trump playbook, right? And we've seen the FBI director, Kash Patel, do something similarly when he announces, major FBI operations, and sometimes getting ahead of them. But it's one thing to be the president of the United States, and certainly Donald Trump, and announce, policy changes by social media. It's a whole other thing to be the Secretary of Defense and announcing these operations without going through these protocols that you're talking about, without briefing members of Congress. And, the other thing I would note is we haven't actually seen any substantial evidence from the Defense Department, from the Pentagon, about, that these boats are actually carrying drugs. And, one of the other arguments this administration has made for this military campaign is they have accused the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, of being behind this effort, right, this drug trafficking. They haven't produced any evidence there as well. So there's just a lot of question marks about what seems to be a major foreign policy piece for this administration.
If we step back as well, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what exactly is happening here? The administration says it is targeting drug operations. Of course, we know that the administration has pointed to the fact that thousands of people, tens of thousands of people in the U.S. died last year due to fentanyl overdoses. I was just looking up the number in 2024. It was 48,000 Americans died after taking drug mixtures containing fentanyl. That's according to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control here in the U.S. But at the same time, the vast majority of fentanyl that's coming to the U.S. is coming across the border from Mexico, not across the waters where these boats are being struck. So then if you put that to administration officials, which we have done, and to Republicans, their point is it's not just fentanyl coming into the U.S. It is, tons and tons of cocaine. But that is an entirely different issue. And there is where some of the argument of the administration can be called into question, which is, is this an operation to crack down on drug smuggling? Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, has said this is just a fabricated crisis that is looking to topple his government. And I think if you take a step back, the fascinating aspect here as well is that one of the voices really pushing this entire effort is Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. He is someone who has taken a very, very strong line against the Venezuela Maduro regime and also any left-wing movements in Latin America. And we understand that this is where the Secretary of State really has gotten in the president's ear to say, this is our opportunity to not just push back against drug traffickers and narco-terrorists, as they're calling them, but also against the Maduro regime. So what exactly is the administration doing with this? Well, this massive buildup off the coast of Venezuela might give us some clue. But as we understand to this point, the president hasn't actually made a decision on whether this operation is going to be expanded into something larger, perhaps even strikes on land in Venezuela, or if it's going to remain targeted on these boats, which, to both of your points, we still don't know what the legal background for those strikes alone is going to be.
Well, I think there's a couple of points there that we should maybe just slow down and break down for a minute, because first of all, as you say, on the drugs, you've got the cocaine versus fentanyl issue. And speaking to people within the Republican Party who are very supportive of the president's war on drugs, they kind of point to the maths of all of this, right? Because every time there's one of these strikes, the administration is saying, 25,000 lives have been saved by blowing up this boat. There's been more than 20 of these strikes now. So, you're heading for 500,000 lives saved. And as you said there, Sumi, the number of drug deaths last year is kind of like a tenth of that. So who are these lives that you're saving is one point. And also, I've been speaking to a few people down in Florida as well who are at the coalface of some of these boats that are coming, the cocaine boats, not the fentanyl ones. And they're kind of saying this is a super heavy-handed approach to that, if you're seeing a speedboat coming, ordinarily it's a Coast Guard operation and you're attempting to mount the boats, you're attempting to arrest the individuals on board, confiscate whatever drugs or drug paraphernalia that you may have there. So that part isn't really adding up for the people who are at the coalface of that war on drugs in the first place. And then the whole point about regime change is a whole other conversation, really, isn't it? Particularly that Marco Rubio angle, as you say, because, the son of Cuban immigrants, there's a very strong sort of personal connection. And a lot of people I've been speaking to say that Marco Rubio is actually, the most powerful and influential person in the administration beyond Donald Trump at this time.
It's also this whole question around the use of lethal force, right? Mm-hmm. We've heard from experts, former officials who have said this is blurring the line between crime and war, right? This is typically, as you said, this is typically an operation that would involve U.S. Coast Guard. This is something that law enforcement would typically intervene and detain these folks. But we're seeing this military campaign really, escalate into this sort of war that they're using as an argument. And so some of these analysts that we've spoken to are saying this is a way to get around the restrictions on the use of lethal force. If he is at war, he can use lethal force as a first resort.
Because we saw that big warship move into position this week, didn't we? The USS Ford, as part of this big carrier strike group with which people I've been speaking to have military experience in this country, that has raised alarm bells for them, regardless of their political persuasion.
Yeah, and it's the biggest buildup in the Caribbean since 1962, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, clearly the administration is sending a message to Venezuela. I mean, they have designated Nicolas Maduro essentially as the head of a drug trafficking empire, and said that he has tried to destabilize the U.S. by sending waves of migrants into the country. And you can see that that argument is one that the administration is kind of really coalescing behind. We had the State Department spokesperson, Tommy Pigott, on recently on our programs, and I put these points to him on how the lethal use of force, as you said, Courtney, is being justified. And he said, well, very clearly, this is essentially an effort to destabilize the U.S. through these drugs and through migrants. And these boats are heading towards the U.S. with drugs that will kill Americans. Now, does that then translate to, I put the question to him, does that translate to, okay, if you deem people in the U.S. on U.S. soil to be drug traffickers, does that mean that they could be rounded up and killed? And he avoided the question and said, we're saying in this specific case. And that's, of course, because this is in international waters and the legal backing of it is a bit murkier. And so the administration is very clear that they see that they have the full infrastructure legally to be able to strike these boats. Whether that then translates further into a full operation in Venezuela, from what we have seen also from our partners at CBS News, the president hasn't decided on that just yet.
I also want to raise the point, there's reporting out there that the Justice Department legal counsel drew up a memo this summer on an opinion that personnel who take part in these boat strikes are shielded from future prosecution. And I think that really speaks to, the real concerns about the legality of all of this and how that's going to bear out once the Trump administration leaves office.
And we should say as well, when it comes to Nicolas Maduro and the charges against him, we're not talking about an individual here who doesn't have some backstory or background, let's say, attached to him. Originally, there was an arrest warrant, an indictment by a US grand jury issued for him in the first Trump administration, right? In March 2020, and a $50 million kind of bounty put on his head there. Nephews of his were arrested aboard drug ships and so on. And interestingly, I saw some polling from inside Venezuela. And to that point earlier about the regime change, there is a lot of support inside Venezuela for regime change, that the people in there want a different leader. So there's kind of a lot of murkiness on both sides as to the legality or the correctness of all of this. But nevertheless, we are where we are. And the latest is that Maduro is standing up his troops in preparedness for whatever may come from the US. And, in fairness, what else are you going to do when a big, powerful warship is somewhere within reach of your nation?
I think it's important that point that you make, Katrina, we should say that it's not that just the U.S. Many members of the international community consider Nicolas Maduro a dictator, that the last elections were neither free nor fair, and that he has held on to power using truly brutal, oppressive tactics, and has pushed his country into economic ruin with his policies as well. So, I mean, with those things clearly on the table, the questions about the legality of strikes on boats and possibly military intervention in Venezuela is aside from how Nicolas Maduro is viewed abroad and at home, as you said, Katrina, by his own people. And it is partly the economic ruin of Venezuela that has triggered the flow of so many people out of that country to many parts of the world, but of course, very much so into the US. That being said, it is interesting to see that Democrats in particular here, but also some Republicans who are asking for more information, they are concerned about this phrase regime change. Is the U.S. trying to get involved in a war to topple Nicolas Maduro? And I had spoken to one Republican lawmaker when I said the words regime change. He said, "Oh, no, you're going too far. You're going too far." But this military buildup, the authorization of CIA actions on the ground in Venezuela, possible strikes on the ground in Venezuela, that is heading in one direction that is hard to deny.
It's hard to deny. It will be interesting to see just how much debate and dissension there is in the Republican Party and whether this is going to start to show some of the cracks with Trump's majority in Washington, and if they'll start to distance themselves from the administration stance on all of this. But, one other thing we mentioned at the top, I think is really important to point out is the reporting around the UK has apparently decided to stop sharing some surveillance in the region, which I think, I think points to the fact that they've already played this role previously in sharing intelligence and helping the U.S. find and seize these boats, right? But two, you do wonder how much this is going to strain, some of the relationships, particularly the special relationship, moving forward if they do decide to escalate this further.
I think a key point as well was one of the strikes, 2 people survived. And they were not taken into custody and charged with anything by the US authorities. Instead, they were repatriated to their home countries of Ecuador and Colombia. So, what's been mentioned to me is if you had hard and fast evidence about individuals who you're calling a narco-terrorist on board a drug ship and they survive an attack and you rescue them, why do you send them back home if they're these big bad criminals that... I think that's the issue that a lot of lawmakers have from both parties is like a lot of this, there isn't a straight line from one action to the next to the other that kind of explains or justifies exactly what's going on. Of course, a level of secrecy and confidentiality is required in these kind of things. Like one lawmaker said to me, you don't telegraph and go and seek permission for something that you're about to do that is so kind of top secret. And so, this whole concept of, members of Congress saying, oh, there needs to be a declaration of war through Congress before you can attack. They've said, well, in reality, that doesn't really happen because you can't do that. You lose the element of surprise and whatever you're about to do becomes a lot more difficult and a lot messier. Not to say that that's the correct behavior or anything like that. It's not for me to pass judgment. This is just what's been said to me about it. But there's this hesitancy and this unknown about what comes next because the normal channels of information do not seem to be flowing in the same way through those in the intelligence community on the Hill.
And what I'm interested to see as well is how this plays with the American public. Obviously, President Trump campaigned on ensuring that America does not get involved or engaged in wars abroad. We have seen him deeply focused on a number of foreign policy issues, of course, the Middle East and the ceasefire he negotiated there, engaging on the Ukraine-Russia war. We've talked on this pod before about the different conflicts that President Trump says that he has solved. This I think is a way one way rather, that the administration is selling this as important to American voters and to the American public is precisely by saying that we're protecting the homeland from drugs that would otherwise enter the U.S. And a very real fact is that many American communities have been decimated by drugs like fentanyl. That being said, if it were to take the next step and lead to direct confrontation with Venezuela, an actual conflict where you see American strikes on Venezuelan ground, you wonder how that will match up with what President Trump and his administration and his supporters have said are an America First policy that would not involve these types of entanglements, if you will.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with the point that has really, stuck with me, which is he's claims to be the president of peace, right? And this, of course, doesn't really fit with the mold of his foreign policy agenda in negotiating peace across the world. And I do wonder about the timeline element here and how much time they have to really, if they do decide to, proceed with ground strikes or really ramp up this military campaign, how much time they really have before they have to turn around and focus on, hate to say it, the midterms and some of those
ding 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 bingo card.
Yes, some of those more domestic issues that really were at the heart of his campaign, were at the heart of his agenda when he took office, and what are on people's minds as we learned with this year's elections.
The other thing that's kind of been rolling around in my mind as well about all of this and about Secretary Hegseth putting these things on social media is there no longer is a functioning press pack in the Pentagon, right? Because, not only, first of all, did the secretary sort of change up the seating order in the little work booths that people have, but we saw just a couple of weeks ago all the journalists there being asked to sign that pledge that they wouldn't use any information that hadn't been officially released, refused to sign it. They had to hand in their press passes. So the administration and the war secretary is very much in control of the information flow here just by virtue of not having people in the building. And of course, you don't have to be in the building to do your job, right? But it definitely makes it easier.
Certainly. I mean, I think we see that across the government. Even at the White House, I've spoken to many members of the press corps who feel like they've been restricted. They've recently closed off upper press, where the White House press secretary sits and the communications director sits, to members of the press. And I think, the more extreme version here, as you said, is at the Pentagon. And, while I don't think it will stop reporters from doing their job, it certainly is going to play a role in how quickly we're getting this information and, who's leaking this information. And, I think it will have play a major role on how much of a comprehensive picture we get on this campaign.
Yeah, and the Pentagon, the very real fact of or consequence of what you both have described is that at the Pentagon, at regular briefings, you will not have the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, facing reporters who will press and ask for more information on these strikes, on what the Pentagon's plans are, on this buildup in the Caribbean. And while you also have bipartisan calls in Congress from both sides of the aisle for more transparency and information, there is no real leverage that those lawmakers have to demand that information from the administration. And we know that that is a trend that is not the Trump administration alone. We have seen other presidents use their executive power to use force, President Obama being one of them. And, it is a trend that members of Congress might be frustrated with, that not only do they not have the information that they want to get, but that Congress has been a bit taken out of the equation when it comes to allowing war powers or greenlighting war powers. Well, that is something that has been playing out over many years now. And the Trump administration does not have to back down and say, well, we will give you this information and we will come to Congress and seek a declaration of war to be able to carry out strikes in Venezuela. They can do so under limited executive power without Democrats in Congress or any Republicans who would choose to side with them being able to stop them with congressional action.
Well, I suppose we will wait to see what happens next. I think as we're taping this, another strike has just happened, actually. So it's very much a developing story, which we will no doubt be talking about in the weeks ahead, like everything that's going on. Noting, of course, the government is now reopened. So that was the other big development this week. And who knows where we'll be next week.
Back here, of course.
Yeah.
We'll be here, guys.
We'll be here.
Good to see you.
Always a delight to be with you both.
You
Bye.
too. Talk
See you
soon.
next week.
Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.